The frontier town of Red Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Wooden storefronts lined the dusty main street, horses waited patiently outside the general store, and the small cafe at the corner served the strongest coffee for miles. On most afternoons, the place buzzed with ranchers, traders, and travelers exchanging stories. But today, one table near the window remained occupied by a single, quiet man. His name was Dakota, an Apache craftsman known throughout the valley for his honesty, patience, and remarkable skill with wood. Years earlier, he had lost the woman he loved to a terrible winter illness. Since then, he had buried himself in work, carving furniture, repairing wagons, and helping neighbors whenever they asked. Though respected by everyone, he always returned to an empty cabin at sunset. His old friend Samuel had grown tired of watching him live alone. "You deserve another chance," Samuel had insisted a week earlier. "I've met someone kind. She's raising a little family on her own. Just have dinner together. If nothing comes of it, at least you'll enjoy a good meal." Dakota had refused twice before finally agreeing. It wasn't because he believed he would fall in love. He simply wanted Samuel to stop worrying about him. Now he sat at the cafe, dressed in a clean buckskin shirt with freshly polished boots. A small bouquet of wildflowers rested beside his cup of coffee. Every few minutes he glanced toward the entrance whenever the bell above the door jingled. Half an hour passed. Then 45 minutes. The waitress smiled apologetically each time she refilled his coffee. "I'm sure she'll be here soon," she said gently. Dakota nodded politely, though doubt had begun creeping into his thoughts. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe she had never intended to come at all. He couldn't blame her. Blind dates were awkward enough without involving strangers carrying old grief. An hour slipped by. The flowers had begun to droop slightly in the afternoon heat. Dakota sighed, stood up, and reached for his hat. "I suppose that's enough waiting," he murmured with a small, understanding smile. "Life happens." He placed a few silver coins on the table for the untouched meal and turned toward the door. Before he could take another step, the cafe bell rang again. Instead of the woman he expected, a tiny orc girl stepped inside. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her green skin was dusty from the road, and 2 small tusks peeked from beneath her nervous smile. She wore a patched brown dress that had clearly been mended many times. In one arm she hugged a faded stuffed rabbit whose ears had nearly fallen off. The entire cafe fell unusually quiet. The little girl looked around carefully before her eyes landed on Dakota. She walked straight toward him with slow, uncertain steps. Stopping beside his table, she took a deep breath, as though repeating words she had practiced many times during the journey. "Mister," she said softly, clutching the rabbit tighter, "my mommy's sorry she's late." Dakota blinked in surprise. For a moment he simply stared, unsure whether he had heard correctly. The little girl's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "She told me to tell you not to leave," she whispered. She said, she had to help someone who got hurt on the road. Around them, curious customers exchanged puzzled glances, wondering how a lonely Apache waiting for a blind date had suddenly been greeted by a frightened little orc child. Dakota slowly set his hat back on the table. The disappointment that had filled his heart only moments before faded into quiet curiosity. He knelt so he could meet the little girl's eyes without frightening her. "Thank you for telling me," he said with a warm smile. "I'll wait a little longer." The little orc girl smiled with visible relief, unaware that her simple message had already transformed what everyone thought was an empty blind date into the beginning of an unforgettable story. The little orc girl let out a long sigh of relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her tiny shoulders. Her nervous smile widened, and she hugged the worn stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. "Really?" she asked, her bright amber eyes sparkling with hope. "You'll stay?" Dakota smiled gently and nodded. "Of course. If your mother asked me to wait, then waiting a little longer seems like the right thing to do." The girl beamed. Thank you, mister. The tension inside the cafe melted. Conversations slowly resumed, although many customers still stole curious glances toward the unusual pair. It wasn't every day that an Apache craftsman spent his blind date talking with a little orc child. The waitress approached with a kind smile. "Would you like something to eat, sweetheart?" she asked. The little girl hesitated before quietly looking at Dakota instead of answering. He noticed immediately. "Only if she'd like to," he said. The girl lowered her eyes. "Mommy says I shouldn't ask for things." Dakota's heart tightened. "You aren't asking," he replied warmly. "I'm offering." She looked uncertain for a moment before giving the smallest nod imaginable. The waitress soon returned with warm bread, vegetable soup, and a cup of sweet berry juice. The little girl thanked her so politely that several people nearby smiled. Before eating, she folded her small hands. "Thank you for our food," she whispered. "And please help Mommy get here safely." Dakota quietly bowed his head as well. As she ate, she carefully tore the bread into tiny pieces, never wasting a crumb. She even saved the last piece in a small cloth pouch. Dakota noticed. "Saving it for later?" She nodded. "For Mommy. You don't think she'll be hungry?" "She always says she's fine," the little girl answered softly. "But she's usually hungry when she says that." Those simple words struck Dakota harder than any dramatic story could have. "You take good care of her," he said. The little girl smiled proudly. "I try." After a few moments she introduced herself. "My name is Lyra." "I'm Dakota." "I know," she replied cheerfully. "Mommy talked about you all week." Dakota raised an eyebrow. "She did?" Lyra nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Samuel said you're kind." "Mommy said kind people are rare." Dakota chuckled softly. "I hope I don't disappoint her." "You won't," Lyra answered with complete confidence. The certainty in her voice made him laugh for the first time in months. Outside, dark clouds slowly gathered over the valley. A cool wind swept dust across the street, and several riders hurried their horses toward shelter. Dakota glanced through the cafe window. "I hope your mother isn't caught in the storm." Lyra looked worried but tried to stay brave. She stopped because someone fell off a wagon. There was blood. Dakota understood immediately. Anyone who stopped to help an injured stranger, even if it meant arriving late, possessed a compassionate heart. He respected that. Several more minutes passed. Then the cafe door burst open. The wind carried rain inside as a tall orc woman stepped across the threshold. Her clothes were damp and stained with mud. Loose strands of dark hair clung to her face, and she was breathing hard from running. The entire room turned toward her. Her eyes searched anxiously until they found Lyra sitting safely beside Dakota. Relief flooded her face. She hurried over, kneeling beside her daughter. "Lyra. Thank goodness you're all right." "I'm fine, Mommy," the little girl said with a smile. He waited. The orc woman slowly looked up at Dakota. Embarrassment washed over her features. I'm so terribly sorry," she said, struggling to catch her breath. A farmer's wagon overturned on the north trail. His leg was badly broken, and there was no one else nearby. "I couldn't leave him." Dakota stood and offered a reassuring smile. "You don't owe me an apology for helping someone." She blinked in surprise. "Most people would have walked away." "Then they're not the kind of people I hope to be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain tapped gently against the cafe windows while little Lyra looked back and forth between them with a hopeful grin. Without realizing it, the blind date that had seemed destined to fail had finally begun, not with perfect timing, but with compassion, honesty, and a little girl's unwavering faith that two lonely hearts were meant to meet. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming softly against the cafe windows as the warmth inside wrapped around the three unexpected companions. Dakota pulled out the empty chair across from him and smiled politely. "Please," he said. "Sit down before you apologize again." The orc woman hesitated, clearly expecting him to be upset after waiting more than an hour. Instead, she found calm eyes and a patient smile. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm Mara." "I'm Dakota." She laughed nervously. "I know. Samuel has told me quite a lot about you." Dakota smiled. "He seems to enjoy arranging other people's lives." That drew a genuine laugh from Mara, breaking the last of the awkwardness between them. Lyra giggled as well. "Mr. Samuel said both of you are too stubborn." Dakota chuckled. "He might not be wrong." The waitress returned, placing a hot bowl of stew and fresh bread in front of Mara. "I didn't order this," Mara said. Dakota looked up. "I did." She immediately shook her head. "I can't let you pay for my dinner. It's only a meal. I was late. You were helping an injured stranger." She looked down at the steaming bowl. "I still feel terrible." Dakota spoke gently. "If I had been the one lying injured beside the road, I would have hoped someone like you would stop." Mara's eyes softened. "Thank you." For the first few minutes they ate quietly. Lyra happily dipped pieces of bread into her soup while humming a cheerful tune. Every so often she looked at the two adults, smiling whenever they spoke to one another. Dakota finally asked, "Was the farmer badly hurt?" Mara nodded. "His wagon wheel snapped while carrying lumber. The horse panicked, and the wagon rolled into a ditch. His leg was trapped underneath." "What did you do?" "I used branches to support the wagon until neighbors arrived. Then we carried him home." Dakota listened with admiration. "You've done that before." "A few times," she admitted. "My husband used to teach me basic first aid. After he passed away, I kept helping whenever someone needed it." Dakota lowered his eyes respectfully. "I'm sorry for your loss." She gave a small, grateful smile. "It's been 5 years." He nodded. "My wife passed away nearly 6 years ago." Their eyes met across the table. Neither needed to explain the loneliness that followed such loss. Lyra quietly reached across the table and placed one small hand on her mother's arm. "Mommy cries sometimes," she whispered honestly. Mara blushed. "Lyra. But only when she thinks I'm asleep." Dakota didn't laugh or pretend not to hear. Instead, he said softly, "Grief has a way of visiting when the house grows quiet." Mara looked at him with surprise. "You understand?" "I do." For the first time in years, she felt she was speaking with someone who truly knew what it meant to keep living after losing everything. The conversation slowly became easier. They spoke about the valley, their favorite seasons, repairing fences, growing vegetables, and the beauty of the nearby mountains after the first snowfall. Lyra entertained herself by drawing little pictures with a piece of charcoal on scrap paper the waitress had given her. After finishing one drawing, she proudly slid it across the table. Dakota picked it up. It showed 3 smiling figures holding hands beneath a bright sun. One was clearly a tall Apache man. Another was an orc woman. Between them stood a tiny orc girl with oversized rabbit ears drawn on top of her own head. Dakota couldn't help smiling. "Is this us?" Lyra nodded enthusiastically. "I like how happy everyone looks." Mara covered her face in embarrassment. "Lyra, sweetheart." "What?" the little girl asked innocently. "It's just a picture." Dakota carefully folded the drawing instead of leaving it on the table. "I think it's beautiful," he said. Lyra's face lit up with pride. Outside, the storm began to fade, and golden evening sunlight broke through the clouds. Its warm rays spilled across the cafe floor, filling the room with a quiet sense of peace. As Dakota looked at the simple child's drawing tucked safely into his pocket, he realized something unexpected. He had arrived expecting nothing more than an awkward blind date. Instead, he had found a kind-hearted mother, a brave little girl, and the first genuine feeling of hope his heart had known in many years. Neither he nor Mara said the words aloud, but both were beginning to wonder whether fate had brought them together at exactly the right moment. The weeks that followed passed more quickly than either Dakota or Mara expected. What had begun as an awkward blind date slowly turned into a quiet friendship built on trust. Dakota often stopped by Mara's small ranch after finishing his woodworking jobs. Sometimes he repaired a broken fence, sometimes he fixed a loose wagon wheel, and sometimes he simply shared supper with Mara and Lyra while listening to the little girl tell stories about her day. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the lonely ranch. Lyra adored every visit. The moment she spotted Dakota's horse approaching down the dusty trail, she would race across the yard with her stuffed rabbit bouncing in her arms. "Dakota's here," she shouted every single time. He always laughed before lifting her into the air. "You'll wear yourself out running that fast." "But I don't want you waiting," Lyra replied with a grin. Mara watched these moments from the porch, her heart growing warmer with every passing day. She had never expected someone to care for her daughter so naturally. One crisp autumn morning, however, the peace was shattered. A large black wagon rolled onto the ranch, raising a cloud of dust behind it. 3 orc men climbed down. Their expensive clothes and polished boots stood in sharp contrast to the worn work clothes of the ranch. The oldest of them, broad-shouldered with streaks of gray in his beard, surveyed the property with cold eyes. Mara immediately recognized him. "Gorak," she whispered. Lyra instinctively stepped behind Dakota. "You know him?" Dakota asked quietly. Mara nodded, her face losing color. "My late husband's older brother." Without waiting for an invitation, Gorak strode toward the porch. "So," he said, looking around with disapproval, "this place is still standing." Mara folded her arms. "What do you want?" "What belongs to our family?" "This ranch belongs to me. It belonged to my brother. And he legally left it to me before he died." Gorak laughed harshly. "A widow running a ranch alone? Don't make me laugh." Dakota remained silent, carefully watching every movement. Another of the men stepped forward. "We've come to collect the property." "You have no right," Mara replied firmly. "We'll decide that." Lyra squeezed Dakota's hand tightly. The little girl's frightened eyes reminded him of a deer cornered by wolves. Dakota calmly stepped beside Mara. "I think this conversation should remain respectful." Gorak looked him up and down. "And who are you?" "A friend. A human friend telling orcs what to do. I'm simply asking everyone to stay civil." Gorak smirked. "We've heard about you." Dakota didn't respond. Instead, he stood quietly between the men and Mara, not threatening them, but making it clear they would not intimidate her while he was present. Gorak pointed toward the barn. "My brother's land. My brother's livestock. My brother's equipment." Mara met his glare. "My husband signed everything over to me after Lyra was born. The documents are inside the house." "Then show them." She hesitated. I can't." Dakota looked at her. "They're gone," she admitted softly. "The chest where I kept every paper disappeared after the funeral." Gorak smiled. "What unfortunate timing." Dakota immediately understood. The documents hadn't simply vanished. Someone had wanted them gone. Gorak spread his hands dramatically. "No papers. No proof." Mara's voice trembled with frustration. "I know what my husband left me. But can you prove it?" Silence filled the yard. Even the wind seemed to stop. Finally Dakota spoke. "I believe her." Gorak laughed again. "Belief doesn't matter. Evidence does." "Exactly." Dakota nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll find it." The orc brothers exchanged uncertain glances. You think you can? Dakota looked directly at Gorak. I don't know yet. But I know honest people don't fear the truth. For the first time since arriving, Gorak's confident smile faded. He hadn't expected resistance. He certainly hadn't expected someone willing to stand beside Mara without asking for anything in return. As the wagon pulled away, leaving dust swirling across the ranch, Mara sat heavily on the porch steps, her hands shaking. They'll come back, she whispered. Dakota sat beside her. Then we'll be ready. She looked at him with worried eyes. You don't have to get involved. He smiled gently. I decided to get involved the day a little orc girl walked into a cafe and asked me to wait. Lyra wrapped her arms around both of them in a tight hug. For the first time that difficult morning, Mara smiled. The battle for her family's future had begun, but she no longer had to face it alone. The days after Gorak's visit were filled with uncertainty, but Dakota refused to let fear take root on the ranch. Instead of worrying about what might happen, he focused on what could be done. Every morning he arrived before sunrise, carrying his toolbox over one shoulder and a quiet determination in his heart. We'll make this place stronger, he said. Mara smiled gratefully. One board at a time. Dakota chuckled. One board at a time. Together they repaired broken fences, reinforced the old barn, and replaced loose roof shingles before the autumn rains arrived. Lyra happily followed behind them with a tiny hammer tucked into her belt, insisting she was the assistant builder. Whenever Dakota needed a nail or a piece of rope, Lyra proudly handed it to him. I think you're my best helper, he told her one afternoon. She placed both hands on her hips and grinned. I know. Mara laughed so hard she nearly dropped the basket of apples she was carrying. The sound of her laughter made Dakota pause. It was full and carefree, nothing like the quiet, tired smile she had worn when they first met. Seeing that change filled him with a happiness he hadn't expected. One evening, Samuel rode out to the ranch carrying exciting news. I found something, he announced before even climbing off his horse. Dakota looked up from repairing a wagon wheel. What is it? Samuel held up an old leather ledger. The county clerk keeps duplicate records of property transfers. Mara's eyes widened. You mean? He nodded. The original deed may have disappeared, but every legal transfer was copied into this ledger. The four of them hurried into the house and carefully opened the worn book on the kitchen table. Samuel slowly turned the yellowed pages until his finger stopped. There. Mara leaned closer, barely breathing. Written neatly across the page was her late husband's signature, followed by the official record transferring ownership of the ranch and all surrounding land to Mara and any future children. Tears immediately filled her eyes. It's real, she whispered. Dakota smiled warmly. I told you we'd find the truth. Lyra looked back and forth between the adults. So, does that mean nobody can take our home? Samuel grinned. That's exactly what it means. Without warning, Lyra threw her arms around Dakota. We did it. Dakota hugged her gently. No, he corrected softly. Your family never gave up. I simply helped. A week later, Gorak returned with the same two relatives, wearing the same confident expression as before. But this time Mara stood waiting on the porch, holding certified copies of the property records. Dakota remained beside her. So, Gorak said smugly, have you decided to leave peacefully? Mara handed him the documents. I've decided to stay. His smile disappeared as he read. This can't be. The county records don't lie, Dakota replied calmly. Gorak read every page twice before lowering the papers. He knew he had lost. Without another word, he climbed back into the wagon. As it rolled away down the dusty road, Lyra waved cheerfully. Bye. Neither of the orc men waved back. When they disappeared over the hill, Mara released a deep breath she felt she had been holding for years. It's over. Dakota nodded. It's over. That evening the town celebrated the annual harvest festival. Lanterns hung from trees, musicians filled the square with lively tunes, and children raced between colorful market stalls. Lyra insisted they all attend together. She ran ahead, winning a small wooden whistle at one of the games before returning to Dakota. I have something important to tell you. He knelt beside her. What is it? She looked around to make sure Mara wasn't listening. Then she whispered into his ear. I've been calling you, almost Dad, in my head. Dakota froze. His eyes became misty. Have you? She nodded shyly. But only if that's okay. Before he could answer, Mara walked over. What are you two whispering about? Lyra giggled and ran toward the music, leaving Dakota smiling. As couples began dancing beneath strings of glowing lanterns, Dakota turned to Mara. I've spent a long time believing my happiest days were behind me. She quietly listened. But every day with you and Lyra has shown me something different. He gently reached for her hand. I don't have a fancy speech or an expensive ring. She smiled through gathering tears. I don't need either. I only have one promise. What is it? Dakota looked into her eyes. If you'll have me, I'll spend every day protecting your happiness, standing beside you, and loving both you and Lyra as my family. For a heartbeat, the festival seemed to disappear around them. Then Mara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. Lyra looked back just in time to see them embrace. She squealed with delight and sprinted across the square. I knew it, she shouted, throwing her arms around both of them. Now you're not almost Dad anymore. The crowd around them burst into warm applause, while lanterns glowed overhead like stars brought down to earth. At that moment, Dakota realized that the blind date he had nearly walked away from had become the beginning of the family he never thought he would have. Spring arrived in Red Creek with fields of wildflowers stretching across the valley and fresh green leaves covering the towering cottonwood trees. The long winter had finally passed, and with it came a new beginning, not only for the land, but for Dakota, Mara, and little Lyra. Several months had passed since the harvest festival, and the ranch no longer felt lonely. Every morning, smoke curled from the chimney as Mara prepared breakfast while Dakota fed the horses and checked the fences. Lyra, now 7 years old, insisted on helping with every chore, even if it took twice as long. I can carry the eggs, she declared one morning. Dakota laughed. You can carry 3. I can carry 6. You dropped 4 yesterday. That was because the chickens surprised me. Mara shook her head with a smile. I think the chickens remember. The house echoed with laughter. For the first time in many years, it truly sounded like a home. Dakota kept his promise. He never tried to replace Lyra's late father, nor did he expect her to forget him. Instead, he honored the man's memory by teaching Lyra the same kindness, courage, and honesty that every good parent hoped to pass on. On warm afternoons, Dakota showed her how to track deer prints without disturbing the forest, how to carve small wooden animals, and how to respect every living creature. The strongest person, he often told her, is the one who protects others. Lyra listened carefully, repeating every lesson until she could remember it by heart. Mara watched these moments from the porch, grateful beyond words. She had once believed that losing her husband meant she would spend the rest of her life carrying every burden alone. She had been wrong. Love had found her again, not by replacing the past, but by helping her embrace the future. One Saturday, Samuel rode into the ranch with a wide grin. I've come with important business. Dakota smiled knowingly. More blind dates. Samuel laughed. Not this time. He held up a small wooden sign he had made himself. Painted neatly across the front were the words. The Waiting Table Cafe. Mara tilted her head. Why that name? Samuel chuckled. Mrs. Harper changed the name of her cafe. She did. She says everyone asks about the story of the Apache man who waited for a blind date instead of walking away. Dakota rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. People still remember that? Samuel burst into laughter. They'll never forget it. A week later, the three of them visited the cafe together. The owner greeted them warmly. There they are, she exclaimed. My favorite family. The little cafe looked much the same as it had months before, except for one special addition. Near the front window stood a small wooden plaque. It read, Asterisk, sometimes the greatest blessings arrive a little late, but exactly when they're needed. Asterisk. Lyra climbed into the very chair where she had first spoken to Dakota. This is where I said, my mommy's sorry she's late, she announced proudly. Everyone laughed. As they shared lunch, travelers listened curiously while Mrs. Harper told the heartwarming story of the blind date that almost never happened. Some smiled, others wiped away tears, and a few even joked that they hoped to be late for their own dates if it led to such happiness. When they finished eating, Dakota walked outside with Lyra. She slipped her small hand into his. Dad? Dakota paused. It was the first time she had called him that aloud. He knelt beside her, his eyes shining. Yes. She smiled. Mommy wasn't really late that day. No. She shook her head. She came exactly when we needed her to. Dakota hugged her tightly. I think you're right. Mara stepped outside and wrapped her arms around both of them as the afternoon sun bathed the quiet street in golden light. The townspeople watched with warm smiles, knowing they had witnessed something rare, a family not brought together by perfect plans, wealth, or good fortune, but by patience, compassion, and the courage to give someone another chance. And whenever someone new asked why the little cafe was called the Waiting Table Cafe, the answer was always the same. Because one Apache man chose to wait, and in doing so, he found not just the love of his life, but the daughter who had been waiting for him all along. The end.